I'm very proud of the work my students did today in the Caribbean Cultural Studies class, where we studied the work of Juan Francisco Manzano, the only Spanish-American writer to produce an autobiography about his years in captivity. I did something a bit different this year as I decided to give my students not a summary of the autobiography of Juan Francisco Manzano, but rather to provide them with a description of the text before introducing the text itself. I use a modernized Spanish version produced by Wayne State University Press, Professor Ivan Schulman. The text also has an English translation, which is presented side by side with the modernized Spanish. The description of La autobiografía de Juan Francisco Manzano allowed my students the opportunity to begin to think about the themes of the text, but not in depth. I then introduced the text itself using Ivan Schulman's introduction to the autobiography. Schulman's reading of Juan Francisco Manzano is very much in line with the canonical view that Manzano was an assimilated poet, someone who had become a part of European culture, particularly Spanish Catholic culture in 19th century Cuba. I have my students answer a series of group questions where they inquire about what it is that Schulman had to say about Manzano, how he presented Manzano from a cultural standpoint, and to whom he compared Juan Francisco Manzano. Schulman compares Manzano to an enslaved person by the name of Esteban Montejo, who did not write his narrative, but who spoke about his life as a slave and later as a maroon and a fighter for Cuban independence. That narrative was published in the 1960s. When both are compared, Manzano appears as a simple domesticated enslaved person, and Montejo appears more so as a radical. But I told my students, in order to determine whether or not Schulman's reading of Manzano is accurate, you would also need to read Montejo. I impressed upon them the same things with regard to the other claims that Ivan Schulman makes about Manzano. And perhaps most importantly, I encourage them not to read my work on Manzano. Today's class, my students considered Manzano from a standpoint of religion and spirituality. And when looking at Manzano, I asked my students to consider whether or not they thought of Manzano as someone who was assimilated into Catholicism or who had a knowledge of another religious tradition. My students surprised me. There was a debate about whether or not Manzano should be thought of as a Catholic or perhaps as someone with knowledge of African-inspired religion. The debate continues, and my students will have an opportunity finally to discuss Manzano's legacy as an African-descended thinker, whether or not his text should be considered part of the Black radical tradition or not. We'll discuss that for our final Mesa Redonda. This is Dr. Petway, author of Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano and Plácido. I'm out for now.